Okay, we are continuing our discussion of inequality. We looked at inequality on the basis of sex and gender. We looked at inequality on the basis of race and ethnicity. And now we're going to look at what we call social stratification. And the term social stratification is borrowed from geology, where you have strata in the earth, layers in the earth, and you dig deeper and deeper into the earth and go to older and older layers. And so the idea is that just as there are strata in the earth, there are strata in society, only in geology, the deeper you go, the further back in time you go. In sociology, people are stratified by their resources, with the rich at the top and the poor at the bottom. There are two types of stratification systems. A caste system is one where there is no mobility, where the stratum that you're born in is the stratum that you die in. So Jim Crow, for instance, in the pre-civil rights South, was a caste system. If you were black, you could only sit in certain places on a bus, or eat at certain lunch counters, or drink from certain water fountains. And it didn't have anything to do with your individual merits. It was a caste system, and the divide between black and white could not be bridged. And we have talked before about the caste system in India, where if you're a Brahmin, you're at the top of the caste system, and if you're an untouchable, you're at the bottom of the caste system, and there's no mobility in between. Okay? A class system is a stratification system where mobility is possible. Doesn't mean that mobility is probable. It just means that it is possible. And that's the kind of system that we have in the United States, where people can rise up the class hierarchy and fall down in the class hierarchy. Okay? So first, let's take a look at inequality in the world. As you read in the chapter, the world is a very unequal place. And if you look at this map, the blue nations are wealthy nations with high per capita GDP, gross domestic product, a way of measuring economic well-being, all the way down to red nations that are the poorest nations. Why are people in rich nations rich and people in poor nations poor? When we think about what makes a nation rich or what makes a nation poor, we think about the structure of those nations much more than we think about the people in those nations. I mean, what makes a rich nation rich? A stable government, free markets, some degree of economic self-determination, like democracy, friendly neighbors. These are things that help make a country wealthy, and these are structural. Remember, we talked about structure. These are things that exist above the level of the individual. So, for instance, look at Thailand on the map, relatively affluent Southeast Asian country, right next door to Myanmar, one of the poorest nations on earth. Now, if we went into a hospital and found a baby in Bangkok and switched them at birth with a baby in Rangoon, then the babies would grow up and probably have the kind of life typical of someone in Thailand versus someone in Myanmar. That is to say that it's not individual merit that would make you relatively well off in Thailand and relatively poor in Myanmar. It's the structure of society. Is there any difference more stark than the difference between North Korea and South Korea? They're ethnically the same, they speak the same language, but one nation is desperately poor and the other is one of the richest nations on earth. And so this is something we'll return to at length, but the idea is that the properties of nations themselves, and not necessarily the people in them, partly determines who's rich and who's poor. Now, let's bring it down one level on the scale, and instead of looking at the globe, let's look at the United States. Why are some states rich and other states poor? Look at that list of states and see what the rich states have in common versus what the poor states have in common. Well, one thing we can easily see is that 9 out of the 10 richest states have some kind of coastline. New Hampshire doesn't have much coastline, but it does have some. They have some kind of coastline, which means they have a port, which helps with international trade. And you can see, there are all kinds of different things that we could look at that determine why some states are rich and some states are poor. But again, if we went to the hospital and switched a baby born at the average baby born in Connecticut with the average baby born in the poorest state, Mississippi, they would probably grow up and have the life chances that are more typical of someone in Connecticut and more typical of someone in Mississippi. It's not the individual necessarily that matters here, because the individual is navigating structural terrain, and for whatever reason, incomes are higher in Connecticut, New Jersey, and Massachusetts than they are in Mississippi. So what is it about the states? Okay. Within states, you can see that some counties are wealthy and other counties are poor. And so what we're saying is that some part of inequality has to be structural. Okay? And so, look at the state of Washington here. It just stands to reason that you, as an individual, that any given individual probably has a better chance of, say, being college educated if they live in the counties around Seattle, which you can see are dark blue and wealthy, versus if they live in one of the rural counties in the western part of the state. Two students that have the same IQ, two students that have the same test scores, two students that have the same motivation, one is more likely to graduate from college if they live in Seattle than they are if they live in Stevens County, simply by virtue of the fact of having many educational opportunities available to them. Same thing in Pennsylvania. Look at Pennsylvania in the bottom left corner. You can see people are well off in Philadelphia, they are well off in Pittsburgh, and they're not so well off the further away you get from these urban areas. And so this is what we as sociologists focus on. Now, no one's saying that it doesn't matter about how hardworking you are. No one is saying it doesn't matter about how thrifty you are. No one is saying no one is saying that your personal attributes don't make a difference with respect to where you end up in the social class hierarchy, but where you start out matters too. And that's what sociologists are interested in, the part of inequality that is structural, the part of inequality that is built in to the system. I mean, I will stipulate that many, many people that are wealthy are hardworking and thrifty and they've done well for themselves. But come on now, some people are rich because they're lucky. Some people were born on third base and they think they've hit a triple. By the same token, there are some people who are poor because they've made bad choices, plain and simple. But there are other people who are poor because they have difficult circumstances, right? Regardless of the choices that your parents make, you yourself are less likely to go to college if you are born in rural North Dakota than you are if you're born in Boston. That's just the way it is. And we know that people that have college degrees have higher average incomes than people who don't. So this is what we are interested in. We're interested in the part of inequality that is structural. So net of the effect of everybody's individual merits, what kind of class structure remains? Now, we talked about the world being a very unequal place. The United States is also a very unequal place. Now, this is an interesting chart because in this chart, what has happened is people have been surveyed and they've been asked, if you divided the United States up into quintiles, every 20%. So you have 5 quintiles. What do you think the ideal distribution of wealth should be? And the bottom bar on the chart is the ideal. That's the way people think it should be distributed. And you can see that people think that the top 20% should probably have more than the bottom 20%. And that's because they are probably taking into account the fact that some people work harder than other people. Let's face it, some people are smarter than other people. Some people are just better equipped in a capitalist economy to succeed, and this is acknowledged by people when they're surveyed. And so this is what people think is the ideal. The middle bar is their estimation of what it's actually like. And as you can see, most people think that the economic distribution is more tilted towards the rich than their ideal would be. But even their estimation of how tilted the economic distribution is towards the rich pales in comparison to the actual distribution of wealth, which is the top bar. And as you can see, the top quintile, the top 20%, owns about 85% of the wealth in this country. They are massively richer than the second quintile, and the second quintile is massively richer than the middle quintile. And as you can see, the fourth and fifth quintiles, the bars are so narrow that they don't even appear on the chart. So the United States is very unequal. It's more unequal than people think it is, and it's definitely more unequal than people want it to be. One of the things that we have seen is that throughout the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st, in constant dollars adjusted for inflation, the bottom quarter and the middle quarter of the American class hierarchy have pretty much been treading water. Their incomes haven't improved all that much. As you can see, the second quartile increased their income in 2012 dollars from $42,900 in 1967 to $51,000 in 2012. So in terms of raw income, they've pretty much stayed the same. Now, you can argue that some things are less expensive than they used to be, but other things are more expensive than they used to be. And so we can pretty much say that the bottom two quartiles have been treading water. But look at the top two quartiles. The richest people in the United States have gotten dramatically richer. Their incomes have increased significantly. And the text has all manner of discussions about why that might be the case. For the purposes of this lecture, it's not within the scope of this lecture to talk about why that is the case or whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just the thing. It's just the way that it is. The rich have gotten richer, and the poor and the people in the second quartile have pretty much been treading water. The book identifies a number of different types of social classes. And there are lots of different ways that people categorize social class in the United States, but I quite like this. I think it's useful. And when we talk a little bit now about what these classes are like, you can think about where you fit in the social class hierarchy, or where you think you're going to fit in the social class hierarchy when you're at the peak of your career. Right? At the top of the class hierarchy are what this textbook calls the capitalist class. You hear this election season, you've heard all kinds of people talk about the 1%. Well, these are the 1%. The capitalist class are corporate CEOs, hedge fund managers, owners of large business enterprises, people whose income hovers around $1 million a year. And the rich are divided into two groups. What we call old money, people who have had money in their family for centuries sometimes, the Kennedys, the Rockefellers, and then new money, people who have acquired their money through rising up through the class hierarchy, like Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates or Mark Cuban. And so old money is generally inherited, and new money is generally earned. So these are the rich, and they constitute 1% of the population. Just below the rich, we have the upper middle class. And the upper middle class is the class that is most shaped by education. And these are people that generally have graduate or professional degrees, and these are people that tend to have graduated from top schools. And the quintessential upper middle class occupation is a physician. A physician, a successful attorney, upper level management, business executives, things like that. And we're talking about incomes over $125,000, all the way up to almost $1 million a year. And this constitutes about 15% of the population. Okay? Just below them are the lower middle class. These are people who have generally gone to college, but they went to the state college. These are the teachers, the social workers, the nurses, and look, this is where people from UNF typically end up. This is the place in the social class hierarchy that most of you come from, and this is the place in the social class hierarchy where most of you will end up, for better or worse. These are incomes of about $60,000 all the way up to about $100,000, and it's the largest class of Americans, although there's a lot of anxiety, and a lot of these jobs are in peril, and people worry about the middle class, and the cost of college and things like that are rising, and so a lot of people in the lower middle class feel rather precarious. I suppose a professor at a place like UNF would be in the lower middle class. My wife is a high school teacher, so we are a lower middle class family. I don't think anybody would consider us upper middle class. We don't make that kind of money. Okay, so don't feel bad if you're in the lower middle class. The working class are truck drivers, plumbers, electricians. These are skilled workers who generally have a high school education or some vocational education. The interesting thing about the working class is that a lot of people in the working class make as much money as people in the lower middle class, but the work is generally seen as less prestigious, or people have less autonomy on the job. The working poor are fast food workers or retail clerks, people who are struggling to make ends meet, low-paid people in the sales force, and that's a little bit smaller class of Americans. And then at the very bottom are what we call the underclass, homeless people, people that are in and out of employment. We see high rates of mental illness and substance abuse in the underclass. So this is, I think, an interesting portrait of the social class hierarchy. And what's interesting about this is if the United States was comprised of 100 people, only one person would be a capitalist. Only 15 people would be upper middle class. That means that the rest of us, the 84 of us that remain, would be lower middle class or lower. So that is a little portrait of social class in the United States.